Elite educational institutions are designed to forge the nation's brightest minds, but beneath the prestige, these structures are buckling under an invisible pressure, one that causes the structural integrity of the individual to fail. Data from the National Crime Records Bureau's 2025 report reveals the scale of this instability. In 2013, India recorded 8,423 student suicides. By 2023, that number reached 13,892. Students now account for 8.1% of all suicides nationally, a figure climbing alongside rising competitiveness. This trend is acute at the top. India's premier engineering and medical colleges, institutions meant to curate the intellectual elite, are increasingly linked to psychological collapse. The systems built to refine talent are failing to protect the students within them. Since 2018, nearly 100 students have died by suicide across India's top colleges. 39 of those deaths occurred within the IIT network alone. This ongoing loss of life has triggered student unrest, as campus communities across the country take to the streets to demand administrative accountability. For years, administrators have largely categorized these statistics as failures of individual resilience, attributing the crisis to a student's inability to handle rigorous pressure. However, a growing body of psychological data points towards a different conclusion. The evidence suggests that the crisis is a product of institutional structure, leading the Supreme Court to mandate a series of major reforms. To understand why the court intervened, we have to look at the environment where the race for elite placement begins: quota. Analyzing the data from this coaching hub reveals a sharp statistical divergence between academic stress and the actual intent to self-harm. Every year, roughly 200,000 students arrive in quota to prepare for the engineering and medical entrance exams, creating an environment of total academic immersion. In 2021, Dr. Sudesh Rawal conducted a correlational study to isolate the relationship between this high-stakes exam stress and suicidal ideation. The study monitored 200 students, 100 preparing for the IIT engineering track and 100 for the NEET medical track. To gather precise data, researchers used two validated tools: Rawal's academic stress scale and the suicidal ideation scale by Sisodia and Bhatnagar. Both groups were subjected to the same baseline conditions: intense competition and the immense pressure to secure one of the few seats available in elite institutions. This comparison provided a controlled environment to test whether academic difficulty alone is the primary driver of the crisis. The first finding was consistent. Academic stress levels were high and statistically identical for both engineering and medical aspirants. But the second finding revealed an anomaly. Despite equal stress, the engineering cohort showed a significantly higher rate of suicidal ideation. Because stress levels were equal, the divergence in ideation indicates that academic difficulty is not the variable that determines the outcome. The difference lies in environmental multipliers, forces like the fear of failure and massive family expectations and batch reshuffling that isolate students. These factors combine to create a sense of social and psychological isolation that turns high stress into something much more dangerous. The microdata suggests that specific environmental structures are the primary catalysts for severe distress, functioning as a psychological burden separate from the academic difficulty itself. The dynamics observed in coaching hubs like quota translate directly to the experience of students once they reach elite university campuses. On campus, the pressure is often compounded by systemic social exclusion and the prevalence of city-centric norms that leave marginalized students without a support network. These systemic issues led the Supreme Court to establish a national task force, chaired by retired Justice S. Ravindra Bhatt, to investigate college mental health. The task force reached out to 60,000 institutions for data on student well-being. Only 3,500 responded. With fewer than 6% of institutions engaging in the national survey, the Supreme Court treated the silence as a prompt for external oversight rather than internal resolution. Most university intervention strategies target individual recovery, essentially providing downstream support while the upstream environmental drivers remain intact. At IIT Kanpur, counseling sessions doubled to over 4,000 in 2024 as the university attempted to keep pace with student needs. But as this diagram shows, counseling is an isolated response. It is frequently overwhelmed by the larger, recurring loops of the campus environment: like marks-based segregation and hypercompetition. Clinical support for the individual cannot resolve a crisis rooted in the fundamental architecture of the institution. Triage through therapy is necessary, but it is not a structural solution to a systemic environmental problem. In July 2025, the Supreme Court moved beyond simple suggestions, issuing 15 structural guidelines that all institutions are now legally required to follow. These mandates include mandatory trained counselors, regular mental health training for faculty, and confidential grievance committees. Most critically, the court issued an absolute ban on marks-based segregation, a practice that historically reinforced the social isolation of lower-performing students. Enforcement has been handed to regulatory bodies like the AICTE, with institutions now facing legal consequences and the loss of accreditation if they fail to comply. The shift in policy reflects a new understanding that an elite institution's reputation is not built on the intensity of the pressure it applies, but on the safety and dignity of the students it produces.